Okay, so once more welcome to our Bible study on 2 Samuel chapters 8 and 9. We are hopefully going to cover both chapters since they're quite short and also because they are fairly straightforward. Let's open with prayer first. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for your goodness, your mercy and kindness towards us, for all the gifts with which you fill our lives, and especially the gift of your holy word, through which your Holy Spirit works in us. So we pray that as we study your word, your Spirit would work powerfully amongst us, to strengthen our faith, to confirm our hope, and to enliven the love that you have poured into our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Okay, so chapter 8 marks the end of the first part of 2 Samuel, where we have the establishment of David's kingdom. And having had the in chapter 6 and 7, we had the bringing of the ark into Jerusalem, and then God's covenant with David and David's prayer in response to that. We now finally have a summary of David's military successes. These are not given in any kind of chronological order, and they didn't all happen at once. This is just a summary of the things that took place over the coming not indeterminate period of time. And then and finally, after we get David's officials listed, that really marks the end of that first section of this book. We will go hopefully into chapter 9 as well, which is the beginning of the next section. I'll talk about that separately when we get to that. But to begin with, we need to read from beginning of chapter 8. If you're worried about the names, don't read. If you don't mind giving it a go, go ahead. Carol, would you fancy taking on the first 14 verses of chapter 8?
First 14. Let me just see where I'm going to. Okay. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and David took Methagamoth out of the hand of the Philistines, and he defeated Moab and measured them with a line, making them lie down on the ground. 2 lines he measured to be put to death, and 1 full line to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates. And David took from him 1,700 horsemen, 20,000 foot soldiers, and David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David slew 22,000 men of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And David took the shields of gold which were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took very much bronze. When Toiah, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Toiah sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and to congratulate him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had often been at war with Toiah, and Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold which he dedicated from all the nations he subdued, from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David won a name for himself. When he returned, he slew 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt, and he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went.
Thank you and well done.
Yeah, you knew those.
No, I didn't. I had to go at them.
It's some of the Old Testament is always a bit of a challenge, but you manage very well, so well done. So first of all, just a quick note on the ordering of the material. These are not given in chronological order in a particularly, but rather in geographical order. So we go from east to west and then north to south in listing the enemies. Philistines on the east, the Moab on the west, the Syrians or Aramites, Arameans or Aramaics in the north, and the Edomites in the south of Israel's territory. And this is the first time really that what we have here or what we have here and subsequently is in David's reign is that these wars are not defensive. This is not David defending himself against an enemy from the outside, but these are actually ones where he strikes the first blow. These are essentially expansive wars rather than defensive wars, which shows that David's kingdom has been established in a way that Saul's kingdom never was. That it's not only, God has promised rest to Israel from their enemies, and now they're not being harassed by their enemies, but they're harassing their enemies instead.
God's allowing all this death.
Yes, this is
These
now,
are all non-believers that are shot.
we'll come to that. We'll come to that in detail later on. But this is the big picture, is that this is what's happening. That God is giving Israel peace from their enemies by establishing the kingdom of David. But essentially, in this period, as in most periods of human history, in most places, but particularly in areas like the Middle East, which is a sort of clash of where there's always been a clash of civilizations of empires for purely geographical reasons, which I'll explain in just a second. Absence of war is not really an option.
No.
There always is war, and there is a very simple reason, geographical reason. You've got the Mediterranean Sea, you've got the Nile, and you've got Mesopotamia, the land of two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. And around these, empires grow at different times at different places. So you've got the various Egyptian kingdoms, you've got the Hittite kingdom in the north, or what we now call Turkey. You've got the growth of the Assyrians, and then after that Babylon, and these empires that come and go. And the bottom of the Mediterranean, the Roman province of Syria, so that's modern day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, is where they roughly meet. So at the very north of Syria is the source of the Euphrates. It's in the very north, and of course in the southwest rather, you're already in Egypt. Egypt comes to the southwest, and of course there's the Mediterranean all around. And then you've got the sea people, a bit like the Phoenicians who go up and down the Mediterranean, and these things come and they clash all the time. And so there's never really been peace, except the only time you have peace is when you have one empire in charge, and then that gives you peace for a time until another empire comes on as charge. And when there's a stalemate between two empires, if there's no empire, like at this time there's no kind of overweeningly powerful empire, then the small nations all of a sudden have a free-for-all.
Yeah.
They have a go with each other because they're constantly trying to play for advantage. So that's why there's always war. So it's not really a question of shall we have a war, shall we have peace. You don't get a choice. If you don't go to war, the war will come to you. And that's simply how it works. But what's happening here is that God has given Israel peace. Just before we go into the details, one other observation just about history and God and history is that what we can see in biblical history, but also in the later history of the church, is that God makes use of the development or the progress or the progress, just the events of history to bring about his will. So for example, that Joseph rises to a prominent position in Egypt. It's possible partly because in that particular period of Egyptian history, Egypt was led in part by a large number of foreign imports in the leadership in the bureaucracy. Later on, that got purged, and the kingdom was established. The new kingdom, which was again very self-consciously purely Egyptian, which explains why the Israelites got into trouble. But that was the means God used then to give them the promised land, which was possible because at this point there was this vacuum between it. There was no great empire that claimed to that land, so it was possible for them to establish. In the same way that the peace the Roman Empire brought about enabled the spread of the gospel along the Roman roads and Roman sea routes very, very fast, because there was this vast land area in North Africa, Middle East, and Europe, which was controlled by a reasonably efficient empire, and there was complete peace brought about by military domination. In the same way that the Reformation later on spread thanks to the printing press. Somebody invented the movable, printing press or developed printing press in Europe, and less than 100 years later comes the Reformation, and all of a sudden the ideas of the Reformation can spread vast distances simply by people carrying pamphlets and books. So all these things have got to work through history, and we can always say, did this happen because God was at work? Did it happen because these were the right historical circumstances? And the answer is yes to both. Is the kettle boiling because there's electricity, or is the kettle boiling because I decided to make tea? Yes. It's both, and you need both.
An awful lot of horses, isn't there?
We'll come to the horses.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think that would be their main mode of transport, or for any reason, wouldn't it?
Yes. We'll come to we'll come to all the details as we go on. So I just want to give you the kind of big picture to get us started. So after this, after God's covenant with David, we are told, first of all, the Philistines. David defeated the Philistines and subdued them and took Metheg Ammah out of the hand of the Philistines. So this is the last time, or after this point, the Philistines are no longer a problem. Up till now, from the beginning of 1 Samuel, before, from the book of Judges and Samson, the Philistines have been the main enemy, the main threat to Israel. And there's been this constant threat that comes from the fact that the Philistines were the superior force. They're the superior force, and therefore they were constantly threatening Israel, and Israel were often subservient to them. So the system would be that if you got war, that whoever wins subdues the other and takes tribute from them. And by paying tribute, you're saying we acknowledge the fact that you won and you're stronger than us. But by paying tribute, you then are left in peace until you stop paying tribute, at which point then they'll come and try and get it back. And this is exactly what happened all the way through until now. But now David defeats the Philistines and subdues them, literally humble them, which means that they were no longer in a position of preeminence. And he took Metheg Ammah out of the hand of the Philistines, which is, we don't really know much about Metheg Ammah, but presumably it's a place. So he took some of their territory. Now, one thing that he doesn't do that he does to the other nations here, there's no mention of any tribute. So he humbles the Philistines, he humiliates them, but he doesn't take away their independence. But they're kind of left on their strip of land, the coastal strip between Judea and the Mediterranean Sea. So that's Philistines dealt with. And we don't really hear much about the Philistines after this. That's kind of their time's past. Then comes Moab, which is on the other side. Moab is on the other side of the Jordan, in the so the Philistines are to the west of Israel, and Moab is to the east towards the wilderness. And he defeated Moab. And then comes this great slaughter of Moab's of the captured soldiers. The verb to decimate. If you decimate something, it's decimated.
Oh, to decimate. Yes, I
Yeah.
thought it said decimate.
No, decimate.
Oh,
So the
yeah.
idea in modern English, decimate means you kind of get rid of it. Well, the
Yeah.
original meaning of decimate, and every now and then you get pedants who insist that that's what it should still mean in English, is the Romans had this system where they would decimate, take captured prisoners. They would take 1 in 10.
Right.
That's what decimate means. So you don't get rid of 90%, you get rid of 10%.
Oh.
You decimate, take 1 in 10 prisoners, and you execute them, and you keep the rest alive. It's in the it's a famous phrase that Napoleon Bonaparte used when he hanged one of his generals after the general lost a battle. He said he did it to encourage the others.
Yeah.
And this decimating was perhaps could be seen as, I think, we'll take just 1 in 10. If you let the rest of you sit tight, we'll leave you in peace. But David didn't decimate the Moabites. He took 2/3, made them lie down, and measured 2 lines, put to death, 1 to be spared. So one in 3 survived, and 2 out of 3 were put to death. I was reading a couple of different commentaries on this, but before I tell you what they say, what does this tell you about David? This fact that he did so.
He wants to kill all his enemies.
Well, yeah, but he's not
He's
killing
selective. He's making some of them follow him by.
Well, they don't follow him.
Threatening.
With becoming
the
servant.
ones that
They become servants. But what's it? But what's it? Yeah.
Was it a command from God that that's how he was to?
No, because the Moabites are outside the promised land.
Oh.
So it's the nations that were inside the promised land, but they're outside the promised land. Well, it's very interesting. I looked at 2 different scholarly commentaries, both written by very sort of devout and Lutheran scholars who have a very high view of scripture and so on. So they were both batting on the same side spiritually. And one says that this shows how that even when he defeats his enemies, David remained merciful in not killing them all. And the other one says that this rather fierce punishment by David was just showed how deep the enmity between the 2 nations was. So one says he was fierce, the other says he was merciful.
Take your pick.
You take your pick. But obviously it's, and these are fighting men, these are soldiers. So you know, they didn't die in battle, they died after the battle. But obviously it's a significant event, otherwise it wouldn't be. This is not usual practice, which is why it's reported. We do hear that all, killing of all fighting men, it's not unusual. But the end point is important. Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. Now the word servant is a bit of a weasel word in the Bible when we read in English, because Hebrew does not distinguish between servant and slave. It's the same word. And so every time you see servant, you can take out servant and turn it into slave. And if your Bible says slave, in the Old Testament, the translators decided that that's what it means. It's the same word. They could have translated servant. It's a kind of value judgment as to which this is. Given that they didn't volunteer, they didn't apply for a job in Israel, this is to say they became servants, really means that he subdued that it doesn't mean they became slaves, but rather he took away their freedom, he took away their independence and their liberty, and they are now under his kosh. NIV, I think, says they became subject to David, which is the same principle, and they brought tribute. That is to say, they were now under obligation, and again, they had to pay tribute or else. So that's the Moabites. Now that's the enemies on one side and the other side, on the west and on the east. And then comes this longer story about Hadadezer. The pronunciation is not entirely clear. King of Zobah. Now, could somebody tell me where Zobah is? Because I don't know.
It's not on there, is it, Rosemary?
It's not on there because we don't know where. We're not quite.
No one
Nobody knows
knows
where
where
Zobah is exactly. Some people suggest Aleppo or somewhere in that region, but we're left guessing somewhat. The people for whom this was originally written, they clearly knew. but we don't know. As he went to restore his power at the river Euphrates, or his control. Who's he? Did David go to the Euphrates, or did Hadadezer go to Euphrates?
It's not clear, is it?
It's not. That's precisely the point. It could be either. Either it means that he went in the Hadadezer went there, that he was kind of he went there to establish kind of maybe lost control of that part. So that's right in the north.
Right.
Yeah, he says over there, but again, that's a guess. So the map says over into the north, only on the assumption because the Euphrates is up there.
Yeah, oh, well, that's reasonable.
Or that David went there to somehow do something, but it seems to make better sense to think that Hadadezer went there. And for reasons not given, David decides to take him on. Now, is it that Zoba is further to the south, and when Hadadezer went to the north, David attacked, took advantage of the absence of Hadadezer, and if he taking his army to the north, and so now there's a vacuum and went there? Or is it the case that David actually marched all the way up to the Euphrates? It's not that far; it's still within Syria, but we don't know. We just know that this war took place, and the significant thing here is the next verse. That David took from him 1,700 horsemen, 20,000 foot soldiers, and David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. Different explanations of this. Obviously, when you hamstring a horse, you disable it, and it can no longer run. They can only walk slowly. It's not very nice for them.
No.
And therefore they become useless. It's a bit like it's like blowing out the tires on, blowing out the tracks on a tank or something. They can no longer be driven. Now, why did he do that?
Doesn't make any sense, really, does it?
It does make sense. The question is, what kind of sense it makes?
So they can't come after him.
Well, this is his cavalry, and the cavalry, of course, is you've got in those days you've got cavalry and you've got infantry, foot soldiers, and the cavalry is mostly chariot cavalry, because until at this time it's more or less bareback riding, which means that it's not particularly nimble stuff. And in fact, mounted cavalry really became super effective with the invention of the stirrup. And that wasn't until about just over 1,000 years ago. So until then, there have been, the Arabs and many other nations did have mounted cavalry, but it's not as effective because the lack of a stirrup means that it's harder to control the horse and stay on it at the same time. And so cavalry was mostly chariots. Of course, chariots have wheels and then require roads or plains at least, so that you can draw on them. Where's David king of?
Where was the king of? Well, the whole of that area, really.
Well, Israel, mostly, and his capital is in Jerusalem. And could you describe the geography of the area around Jerusalem?
Well, it's high, isn't it?
Hill country, yes. So he's not brilliant. He's not brilliant
It's not
cavalry.
brilliant for horses, is it?
Well, he's not brilliant for cavalry. He's not brilliant for chariots.
Oh, what would it be the point of hamstringing the horses but leaving 100 chariots if they can't be used? Why would he leave chariots?
We'll look at that in just a second.
Right.
The other explanation that I've had given, and this is what I was taught at university, was that basically this shows that at this point, David's if you like army and David's thinking is still very much they're behind the times. They're not very progress. They're kind of in the same way that a couple of generations before, not just in previous generation, in Saul's time, the Israelites didn't have any ironsmiths. They were only just moving into the Iron Age from the Bronze Age, whereas Philistines were already more progressive and ahead of them. And so the argument goes that this shows that David is still very much in the run around with a bow, with a spear and a sword in your hand kind of warfare, and hasn't yet got to the more advanced stage of using cavalry. Whereas under Solomon really begins to accrue a proper cavalry of chariots and so
Well,
on.
they got the swords from somewhere. They're metal, weren't they?
Yes, they did, but that's the point is about the cavalry that so that's one possible argument. Israel are not the most advanced nation, technologically at this point or any other point. Be as it may, if you take away 20,000 soldiers, 1,700 horsemen, and you hamstring all about 100 of them, you are pretty much emptying out his army. And the point is that whether or not David had use for them, David did not. He left 100. Did he leave 100 for himself, or did he leave 100 for David, saying, "I'm not going to completely strip your army"? Because of course, if the armies in the north are completely depleted, then there's a vacuum, and then whoever's to the north of them will just walk in. So he leaves a little bit, but not enough for them to be effective, but certainly not to be a threat. There is one other thing. Rosemary, could you do me a favor and find out Deuteronomy chapter 17? It's the 5th book of the Old Testament, so it's well before here. Keep going, keep going, keep going. One more. After Numbers, Leviticus, in Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. Keep going.
Closer than you think.
Yeah, and chapter 17. And could you read verse 16 and 17 for us, please?
Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold.
Right, who's he in the previous verse?
So,
The Lord your God will choose.
No. Who's God talking about?
David?
Saul?
King. The king. This is Deuteronomy.
just
So
the
this is God
king.
speaking to Moses. So when I give you a king,
Right.
do not go back. Don't acquire many horses. Don't go back to Egypt. Don't acquire many wives, and do not acquire excessive wealth. As king.
Right.
A king, any king.
Yeah. This is still in the
king.
wilderness.
Oh, I see. Yes.
And this is God looking forward. Put Solomon into perspective, don't you think?
Yeah.
If you think of Solomon and him acquiring great big, he marries the daughter of the Pharaoh. He acquires a massive number of horses. He has a harem of over 1,000 women.
Was it really?
Yes. Several hundred wives and several hundred concubines. It's like 800 and 600, something like that. So, 1,500 women in his harem and an enormous amount of wealth. And how did it end for him? Not very well. He lost his faith. So this is what we have David doing here is he doesn't take us, hey, lots of horses. Yes, yeah. He disables the horses, but doesn't take them for himself. So there is that going on as well, as we will see a bit later on. Now, when the Syrians Damascus, so that will be the nation immediately to the north of Israel. So these are still Arameans. I'm not quite sure why they translated Syrians in the ESV. It's really Arameans. So these are Arameans of Zobar that David's defeated. These are now Arameans of Syria. So they're kindred peoples, but different political polities, if you like. We're told that the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobar, and David struck down 20,000 Syrians. So he defeated them. And what does he do? He put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Syrians are Arameans. became servants to David and brought tribute. So he did the same to them.
Did.
Not only did they become servants or slaves or subject to him and pay tribute, but he actually established garrisons there.
Yeah.
So he established a military presence in their midst. So again, they remain themselves, but they are not free. And there's Israelite soldiers there. And now look, David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took very much bronze. So now he's accumulating seams. So he doesn't take the horse, but he does seem to take the gold and the bronze. But what for? That's the next question, which we'll come to. Now, then we have this next king. In Hebrew, his name is roughly Toi, and is translated as, or transliterated as Toy in ESV, Tu, or Toe in the NIV.
Different spellings, I suppose.
Yeah, it's just different. Or how do you write that in English? It's the Greek gives it just Thou. His name is Thau. Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer. Then he sent his son to David and to ask about his health, which is really saying, say hello, greet him, and to bless him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had often been at war with Toi. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Joram, son of the crown prince, brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. So not only is David militarily successful, but he's now made a new friend, new alliance, and he's profiting from his plan. So he's got all these people pay tribute, he's taken loot and plunder, and now he's got somebody else going to say, let me give you some more because I'm so grateful. And look at the next verse. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he dedicated from all the nations he subdued. So what had he done with all this wealth that he accrued?
Given it to God, really.
Dedicated to the Lord. He didn't put it in his coffers, he didn't build himself a bigger palace or acquire a few more wives. Instead, he dedicated to the Lord. Now, what does that mean in practice? What does it mean to dedicate to the Lord?
Gives. You get there? No. Giving memory? No.
There's actually a very specific purpose for it here, because David had a different project in mind when he became king. His first project was to bring the ark to Jerusalem, and the second one was to build a house.
To build a temple.
That's right, to build a temple, to have a house for the Lord. So, far be from, why should I live in a house of cedar and the Lord is in a tent? And God said, no, your son shall do it. And so what it does two things. First of all, it gives David the, if you like, the time and the resources to do what he's doing now, to establish the peace, because he's not spending all his time and money building a temple. Building a temple is expensive, and if you're spending it on that, you're not spending it on your armies. So you can take the wealth that he would have spent on the building and instead wage war. I mean, why do we have taxes in this country? Do you know? What's the reason we have taxes in this country historically? Where did they come from?
Well, was it to support the defense of the country?
Taxes were raised to fight wars. It wasn't, and a permanent income tax was first established during the Napoleonic Wars. There was no income tax. So king went to war and he would go and he'd start suddenly, call Parliament and get Parliament to raise taxes so that he can pay more. And every now and then Parliament would say no, and then there'd be a big kerfuffle over it, and King John and the Magna Carta and all that kind of business comes to play. So you have to raise money because war is expensive. You're taking all these productive men from the land and from their jobs, and you send them out, and you have to feed them while they're not doing while they're not feeding the nation. And so it has to be paid for somehow. And in the same way, David, instead of, he's got surplus, instead of spending it on building projects, he's spending it on the army. He's able to do that because he's not building the temple. And Solomon is able to do what he does, which is do a lot of building, because the peace has already been established by his father.
Mm.
So he enters or takes to the throne, rises to the throne at a time when there is no more war, because the enemies of Israel have been subdued. So these two things is actually, you can see again, God's wisdom is that, no, you don't need to do that. It's a little bit like you hear sometimes stories of missionaries who go out somewhere where the gospel's never been preached before. And they work and work and work and work, and they come home and they say, well, we baptized 3 people and one of them died and the other 2 gave up the faith after a week, and then that was our 30 years working with these people here. And sometimes you hear people who come home and they feel like we failed, and then they go and are laid to rest in their graves, and the next generation go to this place, and the church is built up because they laid the foundation. They did that, they kind of broke the ground on that work, and then God said, okay, God took glory. The pioneers couldn't take glory because they seemed to be unsuccessful, and the second generation couldn't claim glory because they weren't the pioneers. God took the glory, and he prepared the ground, and then he did the work. And he often does that, which is why we must be really, really careful not to think that what's going on in the church today is what's going to be going on, either in good or in ill. But rather say, okay, we have our task that we've been called to, and we must be faithful in that, and then God works his plans out in the way that he's going to do it. And it might be that he's in the process of demolishing old things so that there's room for new things, or he might lay the groundwork for things that we can't even envisage yet. Somebody was saying to me the other day, I was having a conversation about strategic planning in church. How do you do strategic planning for the work of the church? And he said, well, unless your strategic vision is for the next 100 and 200 years, you're wasting your time. And if your strategic vision is for the next 200 years, you can't know what's happening in 100 years time. So you just better stop thinking about that and just get on with what you're supposed to be getting on with, rather than making grand plans. But here we see God's wisdom, that he's and what David is doing, he's accruing wealth. He's dedicating all this loot and all these gifts, he's dedicating to the Lord, so that when it comes for Solomon to build a temple, there's all this gold and silver and bronze and things already been acquired. This wealth has been acquired.
It's been kept in Jerusalem.
Yes. Yeah. So he's
it's
storing.
been set aside for a purpose, then, hasn't it?
Yeah. This been set aside so that he doesn't have to start from scratch. He's not like, there's peace now. Where would he get the money? He said, oh, David already laid the groundwork. And if you read 1 Chronicles, for example, which tells the same history again from a different perspective, and very much from the perspective of the link between history and worship. So it tells the whole story of 2 Samuel onwards, from the perspective of how does the faithfulness of Israel as in worship link to the history of Israel as a nation. What you will see is that at the very beginning, before Solomon becomes king, while David's still king, David already sets up the staff for the temple. He already established the priests and the Levites and the various staff, so that when the temple's built, they're ready to go. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a question, because it's not exactly about this text, but it's connected to it. When Solomon was praying to God, he was asking for wisdom, and then he was told that because you didn't ask but anything else, I will give you riches. And here and at the same time, here we have this text that says that you should not have lots of riches. So we know that he fell. The reason was the women, not the riches, perhaps. But how do you understand this one? Even if he was told that you should not gather, he still had them. He was given them.
Yeah, that's a good question. The word in Deuteronomy is excessive. You shouldn't have excessive gold and silver. And you could always ask, what's excessive? Well, excessive is when you have an excess, more than you have use for. And there are sometimes you come across Christians who are very, very wealthy. And I have come across the attitude you were saying, somehow you kind of automatically disapprove of Christians who are too wealthy. Christians should be wealthy, but actually, if you're a wealthy person, there are 2 things you can do with that. You can have it as an excess, and you just keep buying a bigger car and a bigger house and a bigger boat and flying out more and having more of this and more of that. and spending it on yourself, or you keep in the bank sitting idle and doing absolutely nothing, or you can put it to work. And you can do with it all those things that you couldn't do if you were poor, which is help those who are poor, for example. Sometimes you could take an analogy from politics where people often complain that the rich should pay more tax, but actually as a tax burden, as a share of the tax burden, the rich pay an enormous amount of it because they're rich. And if you get taxed on 10% of a million, 20% of a million as opposed to 20% of 20,000, you are actually paying, if you take the whole tax burden, the rich pay a very, very large chunk of it, whereas the very poor don't pay tax at all. And in the same way, and that's how it should be. These things are given for this use, and likewise in the church, that's why one reason why I'm such a keen fan on tithing, paying the 10% of it, because then everybody's paying the same proportion of their income. Everybody's, like in that sense, it's entirely fair and equal. And then those who actually have a lot are giving a lot. To those who much has been given, much will be demanded. And we had, we had the parable of the unjust manager, or the devious steward the other week, Sunday, as a gospel reading, the one who rewrote his master's debts. And a few verses after the parable, Jesus continues and says, he who is faithful in a little is also faithful in much. And so excessive wealth is where you go, where you begin to, where you are accumulating wealth beyond, if you like, righteous use. Jesus, but unrighteous manner. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Good. And so, God gives us things, and the question is, well, what are we to do with them? I mean, I remember a particular family from my childhood where the father was extremely successful in his work, working in a company that was very successful, and he was very much involved in that success. And one of the impacts of that success was that he really got into sailing and bought a nice boat, and then a slightly nicer boat, and a slightly nicer boat on the one hand because he could afford it all of a sudden. And somebody who quite approves of sailing, good for him. And he also stopped going to church. And said, okay, that was excessive wealth. And there were other people growing up in the same parish that I was who were wealthier than him, who didn't stop going to church, and who didn't necessarily enrich, didn't necessarily accumulate quite so much stuff, and who instead put their wealth to use to support the church in those needs. And these are the kind of big. This is why God and Jesus warns us against the danger of riches, because they give us wealth can give us lots of immediate satisfaction, and that can make us blind to long-term gain and long-term value. Good. And so we have then in verse 12, we have a summary of David's successes. Edom, that's in the south, Moab in the east, Ammonites north, Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadassah, son of Rahab, king of Zobah. And if you read, I'm not going to give you the references, but if you read from the end of 1 Samuel onwards to 2 Samuel, you will get all these things in their proper places. So this is not, again, this is the summary of all the things that took place during David's kingdom. And the impact of this was that David made a name for himself. When or after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. Edomites went south. These are descendants of Esau. So Israel was descendants of Jacob. Edom was descendants of Esau, and they originally they ought to have been a kindred nation because of their close kinship. But Edom was hostile to Israel when they returned from Egypt, and that's how their relations for the rest of the time. As is often the case, that people who are it's the kind of the small differences that matter more than so people often are more hostile to those who are close to them when they are hostilities than those who are very far from them. So if you go to, if you think of relations between, I don't know, the French and the Germans over the last few hundred years, there's been a lot of war, and actually they're both descendants of the same people. They just speak a different language, and somehow the French are less bothered by what's going on in Mongolia, even though the Mongolians are very much different and used to come down and raid and loot and pillage 1,000 years ago. It's the proximity that makes it. With Edom, that's very much the case. The Valley of Salt, we can guess, is much to do has something to do with the Dead Sea, and it's a pretty. Did they kill 18,000 men, or did they take on 18,000 men and strike them down, i.e. defeat them? Can't tell from the language. But same thing. He put garrisons in Edom. And throughout all Edom, he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So that's the summary of it. The victory this is not David was brilliant. I look at what he did, and the Lord gave victory. This is God himself giving him success, because David is his servant to shepherd his people.
So the Lord must have decided that all these people died deserve to go.
We all deserve to go. It's not about deserves. Who doesn't? No, well, you have to. You deserve to die. I do. We all do. It's not about who deserves to die and who doesn't. It's not that we live and Jesus talks about this in Luke's Gospel, when somebody says, asks him about people who were the Tower of Siloam fell and people died. And Jesus, don't think that these people were worse sinners than you. Yeah, they said, you repent lest you also perish. This is not about. This is not fundamentally or most basically about being counting as to make a list of all the people who were there and then good, bad, or saved, damned, or whatever. It's actually about nations. God is establishing nations and creating a people, creating peace for his people. And these are hostile nations. As I said earlier, no war, not having war is not really an option. Not having a pecking order and not having a constant struggle for the upper hand is not an option. And so God giving David victory means that Israel is free from subjugation. That's really the key.
Yes, presumably God knows everything. And so therefore, some of the people that die, we all die, but I feel sure that if these people were good people, can we say that? Probably not. But that they knew the Lord their God, that they will be in heaven with Jesus.
Yes. The thing about this particular text is that that's not what this is about. It's not. This is not a passage about the saved and the damned, the believers and the unbelievers.
It's not about the individual, is it?
This is not. This is about how God establishes his nation. It's a bit
what
like.
I'm suggesting is that if there's people there amongst all of them, that they could be people that.
Yeah, the thing is that these are Gentile nations. These are pagan nations. So they were worshippers, almost certainly of foreign gods, false gods. Because that's just how it was. And we know from the biblical record and from their own surviving records. There's a famous it's called stele, S-T-E-L-E, like a stone pillar onto which has been inscribed a declaration by a particular king from this era, from this region, saying, he says, his name's Chemosh, king of the Chemosh is the name of the god. Whatever the king is, have been given victory by my god Chemosh, but over and the following victories, and it's very similar sort of thing. It's about I won this, but my God gave me these victories, and generally speaking, that was the case. There would have been. It wasn't that 18,000 Edomites fell and not single Israel. The Israelites died as well. It's just they, like every battle. I think you struggle to find a single battle where all the deaths were on one side.
Oh, no, I don't think so.
And so that's not, my point is that's not really the point here at all. It's about it's about the big picture of what God's doing for his people Israel there. Which of these 18,000 would be alive today if they hadn't been killed on that day? The answer is none. We, as you said, we all die. And in that sense, and this sounds terribly flippant, and I don't mean it in a flippant sense, in that sense, death is not the tragedy. Every death is a tragedy and it's a great loss. But I know I've said it before, in one sense, there is no such thing as an untimely death. Most of us, when we think of our loved ones who have died, we'd rather they hadn't yet and they were still here. So it's untimely in that it's hard for us. And if people die young, like if you die in battle, the vast majority of soldiers are always young. So you've got young men dying, it's an untimely death. But in a sense, which of these death was avoidable? These people were all going to die. They just happen to die now in this way, in this combination of other deaths. What's a much greater tragedy is which you die apart from living faith in the true God. But of course, God, it's not, God does know what he's doing. God has wisdom and he has knowledge that we don't have access to. And we might say, why did God allow this person to die when they weren't even a Christian? I said, well, do you know that they were going to be a Christian if they lived a bit longer? No, you don't know that. It could be that God does. And he knows. Why did God allow this? So it's really a miser thing. I don't understand why God did this, which can be summarized in I don't understand. You can stop, you can put a full stop there. Because we are of very limited knowledge. Our perspective is so limited. We couldn't know, not because it's unknowable, but because we're not good at knowing. We don't have the capacity. But as I said, the whole, if you like, the focusing too much on this individual, that individual, what about those people? In some ways, it's not what the text is about. It's also a reasonably modern concern where we become very focused on the individual. In a way that very often the Bible also cares about the individual, every individual, but a lot of the history, particularly in the Bible, is about the big movements of history, particularly of God's people. You say, well, all those firstborn in Egypt who died. You could start going through the list of all of them, and what about the Israelites? There must be some pretty horrible Israelite people who nevertheless had their firstborn survive. So that's not what that is about. We're not talking here about that at all. We're talking about God fulfilling his promises and the fact that he is fulfilling his promise to Abraham. And these are the offspring of Abraham. So this is really God at work. That's the key point. And God, the glory belongs to God, not to David. But as a result, we've got the last 4 verses. You willing to give it a go, Rosemary?
Okay.
Thanks.
So David resigned over
Not
all,
resigned.
reigned, sorry. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administrated justice and equity to all his people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Eliad, was recorder, and Zadok, the son of Atop, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests, and Sariah was secretary, and Benaiah, the son of Josadiah, was over
The
the
Kerethites.
Kerethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were priests.
Well done.
Okay, well done. That's good. Yes, we've got all these names. So this is David's administration. David reigned over all Israel, as opposed to some of it. Remember, he began as king of Judah, not over all of Israel. And he administered, or just did, justice and, it says equity or righteousness, really is the word. Justice and righteousness to all his people. Righteousness meaning that the law was dispensed without fear or favor to all people. Now, if this is true, it's pretty remarkable because it hardly ever in history is like that.
Only at the beginning, obviously, and not as it carries on.
Well, then most of history consists of the elites grabbing and the rest paying with their money or their labor or their liberty or whatever. If you think of someone like Solomon's harem, his 800 wives or 600 concubines, whatever the numbers were, that's a lot of women that weren't available for poorer, less powerful men to marry. There would have been an awful lot of unmarried, frustrated young men in Israel because the king hogged all the wives, which is generally speaking what happened until the Christian culture began to spread and put an end to it. And there also to say that justice was administered in righteousness to all people meant that this was a pretty unusual, remarkable kingdom. And we see that a lot of that, if you read the prophets of the Old Testament, you see that this did not last because the prophets continually transmit God's anger at Israel for neglecting justice. But the rights of the poor, the rights of widows and orphans are neglected while the rich enrich themselves, which is the usual. That's how that's what normally happens.
Yeah.
And God doesn't like that. God is not the God of Israel. The true God is not the God of the elite. You know, when Karl Marx complained that religion is the opiate of the people, it's a kind of tool of oppression with which you put the suffering, working, laboring classes to sleep so that they don't notice that they are being oppressed. He was describing a lot of religion, but he wasn't describing the God of Israel, who cares about the poor, who cares about those who have no one else to care about. This is why, if you want to look at the history of almost any kind of or any sort of generally useful charitable institution of our society, like in schools, hospitals, hospices, care homes, benefits, they are all Christian inventions. The idea that it was the medieval monasteries that were the starting point for educating in large groups of people, even if they weren't rich, rather than just bringing a tutor for your child and who cared for the sick and the dying. That gave us schools and hospitals. Hospices were a much more recently mentioned, 1960s in Britain, but it was Christians who set those first up. And all this poor relief and these sorts of things, and they all link back to Christian teaching that actually the rich and the powerful have an obligation to care for the poor. It wasn't just like the Romans; they had the bread dole. The Roman Empire, and the first thing, third century, they had the bread dole. So when their times were hard and you didn't have enough food, the empire, the administration would give you bread, but that was to keep peace.
Yeah.
That was to keep the masses as opposed to saying, actually, we owe these people their livelihood, which we do, because we all stand naked before God, and what we have is ours. It's all gifts from God. And when we see this kind of in this summary sentence, we see that was the kind of kingdom that David ruled over, and also put some of his later actions into stark relief when he forgets. And then we get his chief officials. Joab is the over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was a recorder, so it's like a head of the civil service, if you like. Zadok, grandson of Abiathar, was Zadok and Ahimelech, so the sons of Ahijub and of Abiathar, they were priests, and Seraiah was secretary. Then we have the Kerethites and Pelethites, who were foreign mercenaries, and Benaiah was over them. they're a bit like the Gurkhas in the British Army. You know, they're not natives, but they fight in the armies of Israel. And then it says David's sons were priests, unless you're reading Barbara's Bible, in which case they were royal advisors. And very end of verse 18. Does it? Oh, okay. I thought you had
Says what, Barbara? Sons were priests.
Okay. An earlier version of the same translation said royal advisors.
Oh.
That's because it's very unlikely that David's sons were priests.
Mine
And-
says David's sons were priests.
Sorry?
I've got set David's
Yeah,
sons.
yeah,
were
that's
priests.
what the Hebrew
Yeah.
says.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
But given
Yes.
everything else, given that we've already been told who the priests were,
yeah,
and
they
that
don't-
David's sons were not priests, we know from elsewhere.
Right.
Nobody quite knows why the text says that, and there are also suggestions as to what might have gone wrong with the text. Somehow the text got garbled along the way. The Greeks are something different. Yeah, they were not priests.
No,
It's
because
not
they're all
because, but the Bible is not wrong, but we haven't got the correct text.
Oh.
There's been a mistake in copying somewhere, almost.
misrepresentation, really.
It's been copied wrong,
Mhm.
because it was hand copied until very recently. Every copy of the Bible until the 16th century was hand copied, and so mistakes do creep in. So that's where we get to, and that's the end of the establishment of David's kingdom. It's like this. Now we see where he is. The next section that takes them several chapters is that things go wrong. David's faults, failures, and hardships as king. And that runs for the next several chapters. And things never kind of, in a sense, never return fully to normal. But we have kind of established up to this point where we are. Because verse 19 is not the next thing that happens. Because the whole of this chapter 8, has given us an overview over a long period of time of the various wars and battles that David fought, without telling us when they were. We can kind of get the timing right in some ways. What happens in chapter 9 is that we kind of have a flashback. We go right to the start. We go to the beginning, to the early years of David's kingdom and David's rule over Israel. So remember, he served 7 years king of Judah only in Hebron. And then after 7 years, when Ishbosheth was killed, he becomes king of Israel as well. And the kingdom is reunited under David. And we now go back to that. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, is dead. And that's where we find ourselves in chapter 9. It's one single passage, just 13 verses. So I'll just read the lot to you. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He's crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodebar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodebar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I'm your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring him in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet. Why was he lame in both his feet? You can remember.
He was dropped by the lady who was taking care of him.
Right, yeah. So when Saul was defeated in battle and the Philistines defeated the army and occupied large chunks of Israel, a servant, and Jonathan was killed as well, a servant picked up Mephibosheth, who was probably about 4 or 5 years old at the time, and ran away with him, and in her haste dropped the child, and he was lame in his feet from then on, which means that he must have broken his ankles or his legs or something. And in those days, they didn't, especially if your ankles went, that there was no way of repairing that you would be crippled for the rest of your life. So he was crippled by that accident. And I think when we were looking at this a few months ago, now we were looking at that passage, I pointed out that you can still go to many parts of the world where healthcare is not affordable for the poor, is not available for the poor, and you see beggars, who have all sorts of deformities of limbs, which are almost certainly as a result of them being broken during childhood, particularly because if you're, when you're growing and if things
I have in here that he was his son, not grandson.
He was Jonathan's son.
Each time you read the word grandson, I know I've got son.
Oh, I see.
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, let's
When
have a
you
look.
read it, yes. This is the first time it comes up. Yeah, there is still a son of Jonathan, yes. But from then on, yes, verse 5, the house of Mephibosheth, the son of Amiel, and I think you refer to him as the grandson. And again,
You know what?
verse
You're
6,
absolutely right. What's
son?
Yeah. The reason is that the Hebrew is son.
Oh, okay.
And it's when it says grandson here, and in some other translations, it's basically it's a translator's interpretation, so which clearly refers. Because you could say, Jesus is the son of David. Right. But there are quite a few generations in between. He's actually great grandson in so many generations. So they, so it's son is what it actually says, and for the benefit of the reader, it's what he's trying to make clear to the reader. Ziba was Saul's servant, and he looked after Jonathan's son, who was the grandson of Jonathan. So Saul, and you could say, well, they shouldn't have done that. It says son, so stick with the son and let the reader figure it out. Yeah, and you could have a good case. Okay. Well spotted. I hadn't even noticed.
We're all grandsons in here.
Yeah, exactly. That's the I read the same translation.
Yes,
yeah. So that's the situation here. Right. So if I give a summary, David wants to honor his covenant with Jonathan.
Yeah.
Is anyone survived? Ishbosheth is dead. In a sense, we could kind of jump from the beginning of the book, this is really from verse 5. Chapter 5, we can kind of jump over chapter 6, 7, and 8 to this is where the story continues. So, chapter 6, 7, and 8 have really been sort of out of sequence. They could give us a summary. They've given a jump. The chronology has been kind of has been given up for a moment, and now we kind of go back to the chronology here. And he wants to honor his promise to Jonathan, even though Saul made himself enemy of David, and we see later on that, for example, some descendants of Saul come to a sticky end at the hands of David later on in this book, but not the son of Jonathan, because they swore eternal friendship. And so he manages to find a servant of the house of Saul, and house just means the household or the kind of great retinue of Saul. So he had worked for Saul at some point, or at least in his household. How would David find him? Well, there is another descendant of Saul that's still alive that David knows quite well. David's married to her.
I was
cool.
Michal, the daughter of Saul,
It's in
is
my mind, and I thought,
yeah. So if you wanted to find
Yes.
out, he might have asked her as well.
Yes.
Any of your family still around? You know, she's
Yeah.
lost. I mean, imagine poor
She's not
girl.
allowed.
She's lost a lot of.
Yeah, she's barren too, isn't she?
Yeah, but that's a separate
Mm.
affliction. But I mean, she's lost a lot of family.
Yeah.
Father, brothers, and so on have died.
I think it was because you used the word descendant, and I thought, well, she was married to him, so not necessarily a descendant of his.
Well, biologically, she was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
I've been deliberately a little bit vague to see if you're awake. You all failed, but you
Yes, I
can
know.
stay. You can stay. Remedial class now. And sources finds Ziba. We're not told how, but we can at least we can speculate. And asks him, and he knows. And he knows. It turns out that not only is Ziba is actually looking after Mephibosheth, caring for him in some way. Son of Jonathan, he's crippled on his feet. And he's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel at Lodabar. Lodabar is in the Transjordan, so it's on the other side of the Jordan, well out of the way.
Mm.
It's a bit like, maybe in England, it's in Cumbria. It's still this country, but not every southerner would be able to put a pin on the map in the right place. And that's important. We'll come back to why that's actually important. And so he brought him there, and Jonathan and Mephibosheth fell on his face and paid homage. So there's no suggestion there that he's trying to take on David as the kind of next in line in the remaining male in the line of Saul.
Mm.
He's not trying to be a pretender. And he says, I'm your servant. And remember, servant and slave, same word.
Same thing.
At your service. And David, instead of showing aggression or putting in his place, makes him a promise. I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. Now, this kindness word, chesed, is the one that is often described to God, and is often translated as loving kindness or steadfast love. So it's a kind of divine. It's what in the New Testament becomes agape. Just like in 1 Corinthians 13.
Mm.
I will show you loving kindness or steadfast love, sort of faithfulness in showing in doing good for the sake of your father Jonathan. So this is a very kind of, this in some ways, this is very very kind of Christ-like thing to happen. That David is showing kindness to Mephibosheth, who could fear for his life because he's officially of the rival house. He's doing for the sake of Jonathan, not for Mephibosheth's sake, for Jonathan's sake.
They were very good friends, Jonathan.
But in the same way that we can now say that God will show us kindness for the sake of Jesus. I'll show you steadfast love and kindness, agape, this unending kindness for the sake of Jesus, not for your sake, but for his sake. And there's this kind of divine, which is exactly what is meant by agape, this love that Christians are supposed to show to one another. Not because, I will show you love because I like you so much. I show you love because of Jesus, because you are a brother, because you're a sister, because we are one in Christ. For Jesus, for God's sake, Christ's sake, I will show you love, which is exactly what is meant by that. You shall eat at my table. So I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father. So whether it had been confiscated, or whether it had simply fallen into disuse, or whether because the surviving other children of Saul were daughters, where they had kind of come to under the rule of their husbands, and therefore Mephibosheth was living in somebody else's household, this husband Machir, said, you will get them back. I will restore to you the lands of Saul, and you shall eat at my table always, i.e. you will be treated like a prince. Now, the reason why I said Lodabar is important to be in the Transjordan is that some, especially more modern, let's say, slightly more skeptical or cynical interpreters of the Bible have said, this is David being really wily politician. He's going to keep Mephibosheth at his table right under his watchful eye so that he can then raise up an army somewhere else and challenge him. But it's been pointed out that even though you could say that that could work, essentially, the thing is, he's in Cumbria. He's in the back of beyond. He's where nobody knows where. I mean, David the king doesn't know where he is. He's completely obscure, and he brings right to the Jerusalem into the center of the whole place. If anything, he's making more prominent, not less so. So I think that cynical reading is not warranted. And then he not only does he promise them, but he puts it into effect. He doesn't talk the talk, he also walks the walk, to use the NAF cliche. Verse 8, Mephibosheth, what is your servant you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Remember, in this world, dogs were not pets.
No.
They were used.
Oh, yeah.
They were used in hunting and things like that. But generally speaking, they were quite lowly creatures. They were despised, and if you and he calls them a dead dog. I'm as good as a corpse of an unclean animal. A crippled son of Saul, or grandson of Saul. What good am I? Why should you do anything? Well, we already know why. For your father Jonathan's. And that's I've said this many times, but I say it again. When we say that God does things for his name's sake, or he does things for Jesus' sake, or something, rather than for our sake, you might think, well, wouldn't it be better if he did for our sake? Then we could say he really cares about us. Like, why would he do things for Jesus' sake? But actually, it's a real comfort, because if God did things to us for our own sake, whatever we are like, our personal sake, that would always be a very uncertain, untrustworthy thing to have. Not because God is so, but because we are so. And the fact that God does things for his name's sake, for his own word's sake, for the sake of Jesus, means that he's completely reliable. It will not depend on the weather or how yesterday went, because he's pledged it on something that's outside of it. So we can always be confident in God's steadfast love, because it's built on a foundation that is actually not me at all. It's like the difference between wages and income from a trust fund. Your wages can go up and down, and you might get the sack, or you might get a pay rise, or they might dock your pay, depending on how you're doing. But if there's a trust fund, somebody says, here's £1 million and I want the interest to go to Carol, then the hard work's already been done. It's there. It's just going to keep churning out this stuff. And in the same way, Jesus established an eternal trust fund for us. And our wages don't come into it. It's just a gift that keeps flowing, because the capital's already been paid in by Jesus. So this is, and we see the human version of this. And again, if we think of one another in this light, why should I do this for this annoying person where they're not going to be nice to me? I'll do it for Jesus' sake. I look to Jesus and then say, what should I do? And that's the end of the conversation. And then that person's worthiness, unworthiness, niceness, unniceness, no, it's not part of the conversation. It's just that they just get the interest of the capital that has nothing to do with them. And then David does walk the walk. He also arranges this. He tasks Ziba, who's been servant to Saul, he now makes him his own servant for the benefit of Mephibosheth. So he tasks Ziba with this task. You now are in charge of all this property, and you make sure that the profit comes to Mephibosheth. So he appoints Mephibosheth eats at the king's table. He becomes part of the royal household, and now he gets a private income. And Ziba, the son of a servant of Saul, now becomes a servant of Mephibosheth, and his job is to make sure that this property really accrues to Mephibosheth's benefit. And he says, now Ziba has 15 sons and 20 servants. That means that that entire lot of people are now working for Mephibosheth's benefit. So David's giving him a household of his own. And Ziba says, okay, according to all that my lord the king commands, his servants, so will his servant do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And then we're told of his family, his son young son Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants, all 15 sons and 20 servants and their families. And so he lived in Jerusalem and always at the king's table, and we're told again he was laying both his feet. And that's kind of, again, presumably to emphasize the fact that he was not a threat
Mm.
in any
I
way.
was going to say, what was the point of making that
Yeah.
Mm.
statement, really?
And so
Mm.
this is how where things, the story, if you like, we've gone back to telling the story
Mm.
as opposed to giving the overview of all the different kinds of things that happened. And it begins well. David's faithfulness to Jonathan, even in his death, or after his death.
Mm.
And also, this settles the question of the succession. There is no rival
Yeah.
to David. There is no surviving son after Ishbosheth
Yeah.
of Saul, or anybody in the line of Saul who could say, look, I'm the heir.
Mm.
And if you read a bit of English history from the sort of 13th to 15th, 16th centuries, early 17th century, the whole question of succession
Mm.
is such an important one all the time.
Mm.
England got into a lot of trouble because Henry VIII couldn't have a son. And then he died with, when his son did die, their two daughters left, and that caused more bloodshed.
Mm.
And then come the Stuarts, and then coming in the Glorious Revolution, all this sort of stuff. And that was just at the end of the troubles of the 15th century and the 14th century, wars that rose and all that kind of business. And that's just England. And every country almost you can name that could tell a similar story.
Yeah.
And so what God has done here is he has ironed out all that. Now we have a very clear line of succession, and the promise that was not made to Saul was made to David, that there will be a son from your son will be on the throne of Israel. There is no rival house.
Mm. Solomon's the next one.
Yeah.
Mm.
But whoever it is, the family of David is the royal family.
Mm.
He
Which
had
of
other
course doesn't
sons besides Solomon, surely.
We will find out all about his other sons. They get into all sorts of mischief.
Mm.
Yeah. It's not that he had one son.
No.
When he says your son, it doesn't mean
The eldest
it doesn't
son.
mean no, it doesn't mean that. It means that he'll be your descendant. He'll be somebody from a male descendant of yours.
Right.
So Jesus is still a son of David, even though he's
Mhm.
1,000 years later. Of course, this doesn't last very long. To spoiler alert, there will be a rival house very soon because of the unfaithfulness of Israel and her king. But that's a story that begins in one king and the end of one king. Good. So we did do 2 chapters, as promised. It kind of starts well that after this we got more success in chapter 10, and then things start going south really, really quickly after this. Any final thoughts, comments, questions? I hope that's clarified the text for you.
Got a question.
Yeah.
It's that when these people are all eating, are the women there as well?
I don't know. I don't know.
I just sort of something came to me because
Not necessarily, probably not.
No,
They probably had a
that's-
separate dining room for the princesses and different one for the princes, but not necessarily. I don't know. We
You'll
know
find out, please.
I don't have a time machine, so I can't. But yeah, so
I'd never thought about it before until this, and it was like they must have just been outside and they're just there for 1 or 2 different things. And
no, but these are royal household. These are not
Mhm.
women who are going to be kneading the dough in the kitchen. They've got servants. This is the royal house.
They will be looked after.
They'll be fine. They'll be absolutely fine. But what the eating arrangements were, I'm afraid I don't know, and I cannot know. If you want to write a PhD by finding out the answer to that, I'm sure somebody will be very pleased to award you one.
It's all to
But
say,
my life is
but
too
it's
short
wrong.
for that, I'm afraid. Yes. Let's close with prayer. Father, we thank you that you showed such great faithfulness to your servant David, and that your faithfulness also shone in his life, in his actions towards those that you placed in his care. We thank you that your faithfulness towards us likewise continues, and it's entirely sure and firm, since it rests on the faithfulness of Jesus alone. We pray that you would keep us in a true and firm faith all the days of our life, that we reap the fruits of Christ's faithfulness in our lives, and that as you are faithful, you would also make us faithful in our own callings, in the way, in our response to you and in our dealings with one another. That having received freely your love, we would also freely love one another. Keep us together with all your saints now and to all eternity. So may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all.